When we, as members of the Universal Negro Improvement Association, talk about the government of our own in Africa, a flag of our own, and a national anthem of our own, some Negroes laugh at us, but we have only pity for them, as they know not what they do. When Uncle Sam lynches her black boys with her uniform on their back, and John Bull calls her ex-soldier aliens who helped her in the Shanti and Zulu wars to take a big slice of Africa, then it is high time for some dual Afric Negroes to think in terms of nationhood. We are determined to solve our own problem by redeeming our motherland, Africa, from the hands of alien explorers and found there a government, a nation of our own, strong enough to lend protection to the members of our race, scattered all over the world, and to compel the respect of the nations and races of the earth. Conceived, the black people must seek salvation first as a race. Garvey set himself the task of doing this through the principle of nationhood. He believed the black people should be brought into one active community encompassing the whole black universe by belonging to this Pan-African community of 400 million. Garvey's critics often took issue with his arithmetic. Black people could rely on the force of an overwhelming majority, even in areas such as the United States, where they were in a minority. The idea of nationhood, like probably all of his major ideas, had already been formulated by Garvey before the UNIA was formed, as evidenced by his activity in the Nation Club in Jamaica. By the time that the UNIA became operative in the United States, then Garvey could proclaim his disagreement with the limited strategies of his rivals. The UNIA, he declared, did not speak in the language of theology and religion, not in the language of social reform, but the Universal Negro Improvement Association speaks in the language of building a government, of building political power, and all that goes with it. And all that goes with it, the UNIA did have. Indeed, during Garvey's American period, it became a microscope of the African nation that Garvey hoped to build. In the international convention beginning in 1920s, the UNIA had, in Garvey's words, the greatest legislative assembly ever brought together by the Negro peoples of the world. Issues were aired and debated, usually for the full 31 days of August, and all officers, including Garvey himself, were duly elected. Delegates themselves, usually elected by UNIA branches and other race organizations, attended from places as far apart as Australia, Africa, and North America. Presiding over the organization from 1920 on was a potentate, a kind of constitutional monarch. The UNIA Constitution stipulated that the potentates must be an African from the motherland. Garvey himself, the execute head, was given the title of provisional president of Africa. The black world was subdivided into several broad geographical regions, each presided over by a leader. The organization, in its own universal Ethiopian anthem, which in 1920 was adopted as the anthem of the Negro race, as well as its own Magna Charta and the Declaration of Rights of the Negro peoples of the world adopted in the 1920s convention. Garvey himself was bestowed with the title Honorable at this convention. The UNIA Silver Service administrated its own exams and prepared workers for service in the organization. The UNIA demonstrated the trappings of nationhood. Two, by bestowing titles on deserving members of the race. White, white as well as black critics ridiculed the practice, to which Garvey retorted, I am accused of creating dukes, barons, and knights who gave the white man a monopoly on creating social orders, which, with similar logic, Garvey insisted on wearing. On ceremonial occasions, uniforms and robes after the fashion of those worn by the leaders of sovereign states. Garvey lived long enough to see the Italian fascists install a Duke of Addis Ababa after their invasion of Ethiopia. He pointedly noted the lack of hostility to this occurrence from those who had ridiculed him in 1924 for appointing John E. Bruce a Duke for the Nile. The external attribution of nationhood were evidenced also in the uniform auxiliaries of the UNIA, such as the Universal African League, the Universal Motor Corps, the Universal African Cross Nurses, juveniles, and so on. The most extravagantly impressive item of Garvey's nationalist inspired pageantry centered around the court receptions that marked this convention. Such receptions were conceived as of the biggest event in the social life of the Negro people of the world. The 1929 reception was adhered with a statue of the Black Queen of Beauty holding aloft her torch of truth. Among the routine at such court receptions were Her Majesty Candace and provisional ladies of the royal court of Ethiopia on of the UNIA. The most enduring of the UNIA's external trappings of nationhood was its flag of red, black, and green. Adopted in the 1920s, Declaration of Rights as the official colors of the official colors of the trivial as might have appeared on the surface. For the United States, especially, the lack of an African symbol of nationhood seems to have been the cause for crude derision on the part of whites and a source of sensitivity on the part of Afro Americans. White derision over this deficiency was summoned up in a popular American song. Every race has a flag but the coon, a 1920 report appearing in the Africa Times and Orient Review, for which Garvey worked. documented the far-reaching consequences of this song. Bishop J. Lennox of the African Methodist Episcopal Church of Zion of Cleveland, Ohio, had emerged from a theater where the song had been sung to be met by a fist fight between the Irishman and the Afro American who had objected to the white man's repeating the song. The bishop duly parted the contents by, but was moved by the incident to design a flag for the race to remove this source of ridicule. His flag was subsequently endorsed by 85,000. According to the article, Black people at the convention in Ontario, Canada. The General Conclave of the Bishop's Church also endorsed the flag. The flag was a complicated affair of stars and bars and white, red, blue, and purple, and was based largely on biblical symbolism. Popular purple for Jesus' robe, white for the purity of the saints, blue for the loyalty of the Negro to the United States. The flag itself was apparently not a great success, but the idea lived on. The Garvey, who was able to translate it into the more meaningful and today universally adopted red, black, and green. Garvey was in probability familiar with the bishop's article in 1921. He declared, "Show me the race or the nation without a flag, and I will show you a race of people without any pride. Yea, in song and mimicry, they have said, every race has a flag but the coon. How true. But that was said of us 4 years ago. They can't say it now. The race catechism Garveyites use explain the significance of the red, black, and green as red for the color of the blood which men must shed for their redemption and liberty, black for the color of the noble and the distinguished race to which we belong, and green for the luxuriant vegetation of our motherland. On at least one occasion, Garvey gave a different explanation for those colors. Here his purpose seems to have been to deliberately alarm his interview. Charles Mulberry White, a member of the conservative coalition of businessmen, moderate trade unionists, professional people known as the National Civic Federal. He told White that the red expressed the UNIA sympathy with the reds of the world. The green expressed a similar sympathy for the Irish in their struggle against the British, and the black stood for people of the African race. The nationalist implications of Garvey's flag, like other aspects of Garvey's thought, were not confined to Afro America, but inspired nationalist struggles on the African continent too. Thus, at the charter unveiling ceremony on the UNIA Woodstock Division in Cape Town, South Africa in 1924, the future speaker J.G. Gubbs expressed particularly gratitude for the red, black, and green flag, a flag as he expressed it, of our own. In the next year, the African National Congress, also of South Africa, adopted a gold, black, and green flag. Gold for the country's wealth, black for the people, and green for the land. The flag was suggested by a Garvey admirer and influential ANC member, T.D. Mwali so in the 1950s, the red, black, and green could be seen in Kenya, this time with a shield, arrow, and spear superimposed on it as the flag of Jomo Kenyatta's nationalist Kenya African Union. One of the more important consequences of Garvey's doctrine of nationhood was the establishment of representatives of the race in strategic areas. To this end, the Declaration of Rights of the Negro peoples of the world had called upon the various governments of the world to accept the acknowledged Negro representatives who shall be sent to the said government to represent the general welfare of the Negro peoples of the world. Just days after the duration of the declaration, the announcement was made that the UNIA's leader of the American Negroes would take up residence in a black house in Washington, since black people could not elect one of their own to the White House. But even before the declaration and the Black House proposal, which was not implemented, the UNIA had sent commissioners to France to the Paris Peace Conference in 1919. Their lobbying effects did not succeed in obtaining any abatement in the zeal of the European imperialist powers to seize the ex-German African colonies. Perhaps for this reason, the 1920 Declaration wrote the League of Nations off as null and void as far as the Negro is concerned, in that it seeks to deprive Negroes of their liberty. Nevertheless, by 1920, the UNIA was ready to try the lead again. A delegation consisting of Oxford-trained George O. Markey from Sierra Leone, Professor J. Adams from Haiti, who was educated at Tuskegee College William Lee Van Sherlem from Afro-America, a graduate of Philander Smith College, Little Rock, Arkansas, and Professor James O. Milley from Jamaica, a former teacher at Calabar College, proceed to Geneva to lay a petition before the League. The petition requested that the ex-German colonies be turned over to Black leadership, since Black soldiers had been responsible for their capture. The petition suggests that under Black leadership, they could make good within 20 years, then 400 million Black people would not be starved any longer. The declaration arrived in Geneva early in September 1922, secured seats in the Assembly Hall, was admitted to all committee rooms, and met with the director of the mandate section of the league, whom they urged to appoint a black person to the permanent mandates commission. After lobbying for 3.5 weeks, they were able to interest the Persian delegation in submitting the petition on behalf of the UNIA. The Persian did so, but by this time, the current session of the league was within 3 days of ending, and the petition was therefore filed away for consideration at the 1930 session. The UNIA declaration succeeded in being seated among the official delegates rather than in the gallery where non-official delegates sat. According to the member of the delegation of about 300 similar unofficial delegates attempting to present petitions, only the UNIA representatives succeeded. For the UNIA lead suggests the UNIA again dispatched a representative in the hope that the 1922 petition would be debated. This time, the sole delegate was Professor Jean Joseph Adams, a former president of the San Francisco UNIA division and secretary and translator to the 1922 delegation. Now he was upgraded to the rank of the first provisional ambassador of the Negro peoples of the world to France. He would reside in Paris and would lobby at Geneva. He sailed from New York on August 23rd and on August 24th. The British consul general in New York City, who kept a close watch on the UNIA, was informed the British ambassador in Washington, who was informed the foreign officer in London. By the time the Atom got to Europe, the lead probably at the integration of Britain and France, who ex-German African territories were the objects of the UNIA's race-conscious desires, had quietly thwarted Garvey's plans. They had gotten around the UNIA's assumption of nationality by resolving that all nationals with grievance should present them through their respective governments. As far as Garvey was concerned, of course, the African, wherever he lived, had no government to speak to his interests. And so he should be heard as a race. And the UNIA, with its aspirations to nationhood, represented these racial interests. The petition could hardly have pleased European governments, calling as it did for racial political liberty and recalling the heroic efforts of Black soldiers supposedly in the cause of democracy. It showed that all subject peoples had received something out of the war, except the majority of Africans. We readily appreciate the fact that the League of Nations has taken into consideration the restoration of Palestine to the Jews. Ireland has been given the consideration of a free state government. Egypt has been granted a form of independence, and there is still a great consideration for India, who was represented at the peace conference in Versailles through and by reason of the splendid service rendered by Indian soldiers. Garvey issued a renewed petition in 1928 and continued to try to attract the League's attention thereafter. But he never came any closer to success than in 1922. The UNIA drive for nationhood did not stop with commissioners to the League of Nations and a provisional ambassador to France. Traveling commissioners were constantly on the move, establishing personal contact with the UNIA branches. There were also provisional ambassadors appointed the leagues set up in other places besides France. One such place was Liberia. Liberia was where a legation was set up in 1921. The resident secretary summoned up his duty in a letter to Garvey in the following terms: the oral instruction of Your Excellency being conceived from the point of view that the post was a diplomatic one. The commissariat legation and the position secretary of the legation indicated that I should do all that a legation secretary would be expected to do: study the Liberian situation, the people and the government, ferret out all important news about whomever and whatsoever, and make federal reports to Your Excellency direct, aside from other reports that I might send to the council through Your Excellency. In the case of Liberia, Garvey had attempted to establish a legation without openly advertising it as such. In January 1924, however, he dispatched an ambassador to Britain, much fanfare. He had been distressed during his travels to Europe to discover that all peoples and races residing there had someone who could look after their interests except the Black man. The first UNIA ambassador to Britain was Sir Richard Hilton Talbot. Talbot, a former African Methodist Episcopal minister and schoolmaster in Bermuda, had attained the 1920 UNIA convention and was one of the signers of the Declaration of Rights. He was elected leader of the Eastern Province of the West Indies, and as a result of his refusal to disvalue the UNIA, he lost his position in the church and suffered a withdrawal of government support from his school. On his appointment, he was admitted by Garvey to the exclusive order of Knight Commander of the Sublime Order of the Nile, which entitled him to use the prefix sir. He was charged with the task of representing the interests of the Negro peoples of the world at the court of St. James. He was to study the political situation in England as it affected the African race. Garvey considered the time proposition Tobit sealed in January 1924 because 1924 was a year of Labor Party rule. A Labor government, Garvey surmised, would be less difficult to deal with than aristocratic conservatives since they should have some sympathy for the aspirations of the mass of people. For this reason, too, Tobit was charged with creating favorable sentiments among the English working class. For as Garvey explained, if you can conceive the English working man that he has no cause for complaints against the Negro, it would be impossible for any government in Great Britain to do anything that would affect the interests of Negroes. If English workers refused to fight, then there was no way that Britain could go to war with the UNIA in Africa. Tobit, like Adam in France, would be a provisional ambassador only and would give way when a truly independent Africa began sending ambassadors of its own. Garvey, with all the aplomb of the master propagandist, officially informed the British government of the appointment of the Honorable Richard Hilton Tobit as High Commissioner and Minister Plenipotentiary to His Britannic Majesty's government. In a note that read, Honorable Richard Hilton Tobit is accredited by the Universal Negro Improvement Association to interest himself in all matters affecting the interests of the Negro race without Great Britain. It continued his critical have been submitted to His Majesty's Prime Minister and Foreign Secretary, and it is hoped that His Majesty's government will accord to him such courtesies as are extended to other representatives of independent races and sovereign peoples. Upon arrival in England, Toby requested interviews with the Prime Minister and the Secretary of State of the colonial office so that he might present the critical of the UNIA and ACL. His request precipitated a debate over whether a response would probably come from the British Foreign Office or the Colonial Office. One Colonial Office official suggested that it was the business of his department to keep Garvey and his associates out of West Africa, not out of number 10. Keeping the UNIA out of number 10, the official residence of the British Prime Minister should be the responsibility of the Foreign Office. Another colonial office official considered the adverse effects of British colonism in the West Indies would which would flow from any such official recognition of the UNIA. The confidence of the West Indies in HMG, His Majesty's government, would suffer a rude shock if any sort of official recognition were given to the association, which has a record of fraud, sedition, and incitement to violence. Not surprisingly, Toby's request for an interview to represent his credentials was finally turned down. The High Commissioner, nevertheless, did remain in England a while, addressing addressing meetings of UNIA branches in Manchester and London. In 1925, as High Commissioner of the Eastern Province of the West Indies, he fated much better with the Dutch colony of Suriname, where he was received by the governor and given the freedom of the colony. 1 year before refusing to accept Garvey's High Commissioner to the courts of St. James, the British government had seriously considered extending quasi diplomatic recognition to the Cuban UNIA division. The situation in Cuba was unique. Here, thousands of Black workers, especially Haitians and Jamaicans, the latter British subjects, had for years been recruited to work as laborers on Cuban sugar plantations. In Cuba, these Black workers were ruthlessly oppressed and were offered practically no legal protection, either by the Cuban government or by British diplomatic personnel. In the situation, the UNIA became firmly entrenched among the Black workers in Cuba, and in time became mutual aid society race uplift organization. In Q assigned government for the Black population. It was particularly the only effective attempt to look after the interests. Not surprisingly, but the mid 1920s, Cuba had the largest number of UNIA divisions and chapters of any country except the United States. See appendix. In this situation, the British minister in Cuba bought the UNIA idea of extending semi-official recognition to it as the organization protecting the interests of British West Indies workers in Cuba. The foreign officer. Okay, I'm gonna stop at 50.
Okay, very good. Thank you so much for reading.
Thank you.
So, if you guys want, I could pick it up from here. So, let's see. In London, to whom the suggestion was forwarded, decided to sound out 3 governors of its West Indian colonies before coming to a decision. These governors, all of them well acquainted with the works of the UNIA in their own colonies, were mostly hostile to the idea. The governor of Barbados explained that there were but 2 UNIA branches in the island, one of which was composed of a more solid man and lacked any distinctcy and any distinctly anti-white proclivities, while the other was allegedly very probably disloyal. Semi-official recognition of the Cuban UNIA would give a, a fillip to the local branches, which might end in headaches for British colonialism. If, however, he replied to the Foreign Office query. The Cuban branch was recognized as the center of protection of the interests of the British West Indians in that country. I foresee that the society would obtain a status in this colony that might be very inconvenient. It would certainly result in a very large increase in membership, and the hothead in the association would probably be awakened to renewed zeal to stir up trouble between the two races. The Barbadians are generally a quiet, well-behaved body of man, but they are very excitable and easily roused. He further indicated that UNIA members had recently sent threatening letters to, to planters and were encouraging the workers to strike. And with the approach of crop time in the sugar plantation, these hotheads might become restive. Furthermore, it would be inconsistent to recognize the UNIA in Cuba and repress it in Barbados, where it was subject to police surveillance and the Negro world was banned. The British government of Jamaica was somewhat less hostile to the idea, possibly because the Cuban UNIA was largely Jamaican in composition. He was inclined to be against recognition, but in the peculiar circumstance as a means of obtaining concerted action for the protection of the British West Indies in that country, he could not foresee how this government would be embarrassed by semi-official recognition of the person mentioned, provided that care is taken to prevent all idea that this government is in any way party to the recognition. The governor of Trinidad, where the UNIA was usually most repressed among the British West Indian islands, replied briefly that with venom, I am strongly averse to any action which might in any way lead to the Go ahead and advance that a little, please. To the Universal Negro Improvement Association, believing that His Majesty's government regarded the association as one which could in any way improve the position of His Majesty's Negro population in the West Indies. He added that he had recently refused a petition from the Trinidad UNIA to lift the ban on the Negro world, owing to the objectionable character of the matter which this publication constitute to contain. Based on these opinions, the British minister in Cuba was advised to withhold recognition. Therefore, the Cuban government, with the collusion of such American employers of Black labor as the United Fruit Company, increases campaign against the UNIA, which, among other things, was responsible for strikes against these employers. UNIA officials were sometimes jailed and branches were sometimes closed by the government. In 1930, Garvey himself was refused permission to visit Cuba. General Manuel Delgado, Secretary of the Interior, explained that there was no race problem in Cuba, but the UNIA was nevertheless stirring up same. He also issued a statement ordering the provisional government to close all UNIA branches. In Garvey's provisional government, If Garvey's provisional government was well supplied with ambassadors and traveling commissioners, he himself, on his travels, acted like a head of state, requesting and sometimes receiving interviews with such dignitaries as the governor of British Honduras and the president of Costa Rica. The UNIA's assumption of nationality was not without its humorous incidents. In 1923, the organization dispatched an official delegation to, to, to the funeral of President Warren Harding. The delegation rode in a car, complete with a member of the Universal African Legions on each running board. After the funeral, the delegation amused themselves by driving through the streets of Washington and watching the policemen salute and hold up the traffic to let them pass. They had obviously been mistaken for representatives of a sovereign state. William Sherrill, remembering the incident a decade later, explained that having never before enjoyed such consideration at the behest of Southern police, we took full advantage of our mistaken identity. Underpinning Garvey's predilection towards nationhood were his own speculation on political theory. He conceived the major problem of democratic practice to be the devising of mechanism of government which would ensure the permanent representation of people of popular will, a popular will that would be synonymous with the expression of the majority of the population, by which would somehow ensue that all the citizens of the government would be satisfied and in sympathy with each other. He found fault with American democracy on this score. He explained that often only a minority of the population actually vote for the President of the United States. He does not necessarily represent the will of the majority. Furthermore, since the executive often controlled the judiciary, appealing from one to the other would sometimes be like appealing from Caesar to Caesar. Garvey once wrote in a short essay, Governing the Ideal State, on these problems of non-majority government and insensitivity to the popular will. He proceeded on the premise that since all systems of government ultimately depend on human implementation, he would devise a system whereby representatives of the people would fulfill their trust or suffer immediate recall, disgrace, and execution. Government should be absolute, and the head should be thoroughly responsible for himself and the acts of his subordinates. He should be the soul of honor, and when he is legally or properly found to the contrary, he should be publicly disgraced and put to death as an outcast and an unworthy representative of the righteous will of the people. The threat of instant recall and death should also hang over the head. Um, to further ensure the incorruptibility of the ruler, Garvey suggests that he be removed from all pecuniary obligations and desires of a material nature through the device of a very large salary and allowances, both during and after his administration. In return, the ruler should devote himself entirely to the governance of the state, and during the period of his administration, he should forestall the possibility of sectarian interest group pressure by uh, spurring the company of all friends outside his immediate family. Rulers found to have abused their trust would be executed, and images of them should be made and placed in a national hall of criminology, and and ill frame, and their crimes should be recited and curse pronounced upon them and their generations. Furthermore, Garvey foreshadows the unwillingness of the later generations of Black activists to be restricted by established political ideologies, sometimes even to the point of random electricism, by insisting that he felt free to pick out the best in every government, whether the government be monarchical, democratic, or Soviet. Garvey's thought on democracy led him inevitably to the consideration of capitalism and communism, since the concept of democracy is meaningless without relation to the economic system underpinning it. He considered capitalism to be a necessary stage in human advancement, while simultaneously expressing uneasiness at the results of his unrestrained uses. Garvey's disapproval of unrestrained capitalism extended to the nascent upper crust of his own race, like Franz Fanon 3 decades later. He thought that this class among the Black race was more destructive than similarly circumstanced persons among the white and other races. For while white millionaires and endowed charitable foundation and otherwise display some progressive characteristic, rich Black person tended to be among parasitical and destructive, to be more parasitical and destructive to their own race. Garvey in 1924 expressed this idea thus: we have not only to fight the white capitalist, but we also have to fight the the capitalistic Negro. He will sell his own people into hell, the same, the same as anybody else. In 1929, he repeated similar sentiment. The Negro or colored race is developing a class of millionaires, of money hoarders, much more dangerous to the race life and existence than any similar group of men among other races. For solutions to these problems, Garvey leaned towards reform of a social democratic nature rather than toward the complete eradication of the capitalistic system. He favored ceilings of 1 million and 5 million for investable funds controlled by individuals and corporations, respectively. Sums accumulated above these figures should be appropriated by the state. The state should also expropriate without compensation the assets of capitalists and corporations who formed wars and strife in the furtherance of their financial interest. In his own organization, Garvey attempted to implement these ideas by organizing his business ventures among cooperative lines and by placing a ceiling on the number of shares any one person could own. He seemed to have sometimes seen efforts such as these as attempts by poor people to establish a capitalistic system of their own to combat the heartless capitalistic system of ruling class. On one occasion, while representing workers in Jamaica in a dispute with the United Fruit Company, he even described himself as a capitalist in an attempt to show that he also was an employer of labor, but nevertheless found ways to avoid the excess concerning which the strikes he represent were complaining. Garvey's ideas on capitalism and communism can be illustrated also by the company he kept, so to speak. For the third world leaders he admired were generally those with a similar political outlook, people like himself involved in nationalistic struggles and attempting to walk a precarious tightrope between capitalism and communism. The most important of these were Mahatma Gandhi in India, Clement Cladaline in South Africa, and Captain A.A. Capriani, leader of the Trinidad Working Man's Association. These leaders were usually lumped together with Garvey in the communist journals as petit bourgeois reformist. Misleaders and fakers, imperialist government usually considered them dangerous agitators. Garvey's tendencies to social democracy can also be seen in his optimism concerning the election of Franklin D. Roosevelt in the United States in the 1930s, and most of all of his long-standing fondness for the welfare socialism represented by the British Labour Party. As early as 1923, Garvey was reported by the New York Age as being a member of this party. His belief that Labour Party would show greater sensitivity to the aspirations of Black people was a perennial dream of colonized people in the British Empire by one that was usually betrayed. In 1923, for example, Garvey rejoiced over the fact that British Labour Party was now the official opposition in Parliament, editorialized on the significance of its event for Black British subjects. Let us take new courage as well as firm confidence in our effort, and let us be inspired through the achievement of the Labour Party in England and the labor forces all over the world. The ascendancy of labor in politics will bring about a new political order which cannot be as senseless as the one to which they succeeded. Labor may have enough sense to know that the best course it could adopt towards its own prosperity is to be fair and friendly to all human groups. We would not contemplate labor going out to fight other people for the adventurous exploitation of that which is native to such people. We could not think of Ramsay MacDonald as Premier of England declaring war against native Africans who seek to protect their native rights, but who would expect it to divide. But we would expect it to of David Lloyd George, of an Arthur J. Balfour, who represent the Tory element of the capitalistic crowd of their country. We are glad of the downfall therefore of the Tory government of England. We also rejoice when other monopolist political organizations tumble down to be succeeded by the control of that element of the people who know what human love is, who know what justice is. In January 1924, Garvey celebrated the victory of MacDonald, a short-lived government, with a telegram informing the new prime minister that the UNIA looked to labor as allies of the Black race in the fight for national independence in Africa. Almost simultaneously, he dispatched his UNIA ambassador to England. The proprietousness of this time and Garvey's general favorable attitude towards the Labour Party may have had something to do with the fact that at about this very time, the London UNIA was expressing appreciation to the Labour Party for assisting unemployed Black persons in London to find work. This usual endorsement of labor in Britain was partly due to Garvey's lack of substantial distinction between the Labour Party's welfare socialism on the one hand and Russian socialism as practiced under Lenin on the other. For as will be seen later, despite his feuds with white communists in the United States, Garvey admired Lenin for his mass movement and his attempt to curtail capitalistic control, and he considered the British Labour Party to be of the same stripe. In eulogizing Lenin and at Liberty Hall in 1924 upon the Russian leader's death, he said, "I believe in time that the whole world will take on the social democratic system of government now existing in Russia. It is the only wait, it is.
Give me 1 second.
It is only a question of time, I say. England is the first to have reached out to this perfect state of social democratic control amongst its people. By 1932, he was willing to admit that the Labour Party had not arrived at communism, but that it was working diligently towards this goal and would soon be red communist, a proposition that did not appear to alarm him. In the meantime, he had reiterated his support for the party during the 1929 elections. In 1927, the Labour Party did receive an opportunity to reciprocate in a minor fashion. South African trade union leader Clement Caddeley, during a visit to Britain, succeeded in obtaining the party's assistance in the case of Naya Salander, Issa MacDonald, Lawrence, who had been sentenced by the British authorities to 3 years at hard labor for importing into Central Africa 6 copies of Garvey's Negro World and 2 of the South Africa's Workers' Herald. A Labour MP, Richard Wilherd, raised the question in the House of Commons, and Lawrence was released shortly after. Garvey's reflection on political theory, and especially on democracy, found expression in his conception of his own leadership. Though at times showing a tendency toward the autocratic, he was nevertheless imbued with consuming notion of service, which led to a fatalistic acceptance of sacrifice as the inevitable consequence of leadership, despite occasional complaints concerning the difficulties of race leadership and the unworthiness of errant colleagues. Garvey's concept of leadership as dedication, sacrifice, and even martyrdom was matched by a loyalty among a large number of his followers, which astound observer Kelly Miller of Howard University, one of the small number of non-Garveyite Afro-American intellectuals who attempt to analyze him with some semblance of objectivity, wrote that it must be conceded that he had begotten for himself an intensity of discipleship which has no parallel among Negroes in this country. Miller noted that on the death of Frederick Douglass, Howard University, of which Douglass had been a trustee, could raise only a few $1,000s to endow a school in his honor. The Douglass home had similarly failed to become a mecca for the race. In the case of Booker T. Washington, too, his come fellows, many of whom were in debt to him for their exalted position, were indifferent to the attempt to raise an endowment of $500,000 in his honor. This contrasts sharply with the devotion of Garvey's followers, even and indeed more so after his incarceration. T. Thomas Fortune, veteran civil rights fighter, dean of Afro-American journalist, former close associate of Booker T. Washington, and for the last few years of his life, editor of the Negro World, made a similar observation. The editor of Negro World is in a position to judge of their matter because he has been actively engaged in race journalism for 45 years and had known every leader of the race in America and in other lands during that time, personally or by reputation. From Frederick Douglass to Marcus Garvey, none of them had the magnetic personality of Mr. Garvey. None of them could draw a man to him and hold them as he. None of them had a world embracing slogan that appealed to the Negro people everywhere. A petition from the Jacksonville, Florida UNIA division to President Coolidge for Garvey's release from prison expressed the same idea in more poignant fashion. The world has never had a character as a leader such as Marcus Garvey, one of the most inspiring and courageous idealists in history. And this Marcus Garvey is all the Negro had ever had. To the official mind of an Attorney General of the United States, such loyalty was irrational and disturbing, he explained his perplexity in a memorandum to President Coolidge. The situation as presented in the Garvey case is most unusual, notwithstanding the fact that the persecution was designed for the protection of the colored people, whom it would charge Garvey had been defrauded by means of exaggerated and incorrect statements circulated through the mail. None of these people apparently believe that they have been defrauded, manifestly retain their entire confidence in Garvey and instead of the persecution and imprisonment of the applicant being an example and warning against a violation of law, it really stands and is regarded by them as a class, as an act of oppression of the race in their effort in the direction of race progress and discrimination against Garvey as a Negro. This is by no means a healthy condition of affairs. So such loyalty manifested itself in thousands of letters, telegram, petition, and the like, which poured into departments of the United States and other government whenever Garvey was unfairly dealt with. It manifested itself too in such scenes as those enacted during Garvey's trial in 1923 for alleged mail fraud. Hundreds of his supporters knelt, prayed, lamented, and an alleged threatened witness. The police wagon carrying Garvey to prison was obstructed by an estimated 300 people, and in quaint language of the New York Times, several negress showed marked emotion. This paper was as perplexed by these manifestations of devoutness as had been the Attorney General of the United States. And in an editorial entitled "A Hero More Sorry, Unimaginable," it cited Garvey's supporters It cited Garvey's supporters. Surely there ought to be intelligence enough amongst the colored people to see that Garvey illustrated their worst and weakest qualities, not their best and strongest. This loyalty was manifested too in the fact that only about 18 persons out of the 35,000 Black Star Line stockholders written to the United States government official who seized the company's books were willing to agree that they were dissatisfied with the company's operation. All 18 were, Garvey thought, in the employ of the government. Many of these same stockholders were among those who subscribed 4,400 towards a defense fund for the very same night of his arrest. Such fundraising feats were quite commonplace. In 1921, Garvey collected an estimated 25,000 in Costa Rica, most of it within 48 hours. The United Fruit Company at Puerto Barros, Guatemala, reported a sale of drafts destined to the UNIA and Black Star Line of 2,941 and 8 cents between November 1921 and February 1922. This figure was considered an understatement. The population of Puerto Barrios was given as only 2,400. Within a year of his release on bail in 1923, Garvey is said to have collected 150,000 balboas from followers in Panama. Concerning such manifestation of loyalty, Negro World columnist S.A. Haynes concluded that Garvey had demonstrated two things, namely that Black people could be organized and that they were indeed eager to repose confidence and in the support in and support sincere Negro leadership. This is graphically illustrated by a visit to Garvey's Harlem office on January 1920, who reported a line of people stretching over 100 yards along 135th Street, waiting to see Garvey, some for no other reason than to personally express their appreciation to him. Not surprisingly, such fierce ensuing loyalty was often banded fanaticism, branded fanaticism, and Garvey's critics and enemies did not hesitate to describe the style of leadership existing within Garvey's provisional African nation as fascist. These accusations were helped along by a strain of violence that seemed to run among Garveyites. Apart from anti-colonial struggles in which they were implicated, such as in the 1919 uprising in Trinidad and the British Honduras, Garveyites, particularly in the United States, were often implicated in violent confrontation with rival persons and groups. Possibly the most publicized of such cases involve the murder of a former UNIA leader of the American Negro J.W.H. Eason in New Orleans in 1923 after he had broken with Garvey. W.A. Domingo, Jamaican's ex-editor of the Negro World, reported that in New York City, as early as fall of 1919, I raised my voice in protest against the exorbitant exaggeration, uh, staggering stupidities, blundering bombast, and abominable assassinates of our black Barnum, culminating in Thomas Potter and myself being assaulted, kicked, and placed under arrest by Garveyites. In the spring, in the spring of 1920, in August 1920, several hundred Garveyites invaded a revival meeting being held under a big tent at West 138th Street in Harlem by the Reverend Adam Clayton Powell Sr. The cause of this disturbance was the Reverend Charles S. Morris, a veteran missionary from Norfolk, Virginia, whose sermon contained a rejection of Garvey's African program because, in his opinion, the colonialist power were too strong to be dislodged. Uninformed police and plainclothes policemen had to escort the reverend gentleman home, and by a circuitous circuitous route since the most direct route went past Liberty Hall. W.E.B. Du Bois appended his name to the list of real or potential victims of UNIA violence and threat. He was not only threatened with death by men declaring themselves his Garvey's followers, but received letters of such unbelievable filth that they were absolutely unprintable. His friends were moved, he declared, to provide him with secret police protection when he landed in the United States from his trip to Africa. Arguments over Garvey's trial sometimes turned peaceful gatherings such as house parties into brawls, resulting in slashing and other injuries. A case similar to Eason murder occurred in Miami in 1928. Here, a Laura Champion, alias Laura Coffey, a self-styled African princess whose unauthorized money collection endeavors from UNIA branches had been denounced by the organization, was killed at an anti-Garvey meeting she was addressing. Her followers murdered a Garveyite in retaliation. The president and the Colonial Legion of the Miami UNIA division was charged with and acquitted of first-degree murder. The violent streak was not the only point of similarity between Garveyism and the doctrines of fascism and Nazism, which later flourished in Europe. In their fierce nationalism, in their doctrines of racial purity, in their uninformed, indoctrined youth group, in their conversions of the crowd into disciplined, uninformed unit with some qualifications in their anti-communism, in the impassioned oratory of their leaders, in the pageantry, the atmosphere of excitement surrounded their movement. European fascism and Nazism bore certain resemblance to Garveyism. The similarities were not were not lost upon contemporaries. J.A. Rogers noticed these during a trip to Mussolini's Italy in 1927. Writing from Italy, from the Negro world, he said, "The other thing that made me feel at home, as I said, was fascism, or should I say Mussolini. I have been through the agitation that raged around Garvey in Harlem in 1922, and I have but to shut my eyes and ears to color the issue and watch human conduct to hear the same old tune sung to different worlds." 10 years later, Garvey himself impressed upon Roger the fact that the UNIA had, had attended Mussolini, had, had antedated Mussolini with the style of government associated with the latter. He said, "We were the first fascists. We had disciplined men, women, and children in training for the liberation of Africa. The black masses saw that in this extreme nationalism lay their only hope and readily supported it. Mussolini copied fascism from me, but the Negro reactionaries sabotaged it." In a speech the same year delivered in Canada, Garvey emphasized the same point. The UNIA was before Mussolini and Hitler were heard of. Mussolini and Hitler copied the program of the UNIA, aggressive nationalism for the black man in Africa. On other occasion, he pointed out that he had preached race purity before Hitler. And in 1935, he told an interviewer in London, "They laughed at me because I dressed my followers in uniform and paraded them through the street. But I look what Mussolini and Hitler have done with their striped uniform. If I had been left alone, the Negro too would have had shirts, would have had a shirt." The, the question of fascism recur often in Garvey's various publications. In 1923, for example, the New York Amsterdam News quoted a Negro World editorial which claimed that the UNIA had accomplished a bloodless revolution more far-reaching than fascism. In 1921, the Blackman editorialized while Garvey was in jail to the effect that Marcus Garvey is the Mussolini of the Negro race, and no other Negro can or has come up to him as a fighter for the liberation and rights of people. Garvey himself identified one trait he admired in Mussolini and his iron-fisted rule, which Garvey considered necessary at some stage of history. Garvey's interest in Hitler's coincided with his rise to influence.
After this, I will.
Oh, that's late.
Mm.
What time is it?
It's 2 minutes to 10.
Okay. Garvey's interest in Hitler's coincided with his rise to influence in Germany. Indeed, even before Hitler's journey to power, Garvey, on a visit to Germany in 1928, was impressed by German thoroughness and discipline. He suggested that Black people might profitably imbibe these qualities. In 1932, the editor of the New Jamaica praised Hitler's role as a patriot, a view that Garvey shared. Garvey hoped that the Black race would produce a Hitler that and that Black people would acquaint themselves with Hitler's ideas. By 1934, though, by 1934, though mindful of his own experience in the United States and Jamaica, he concluded that a Black Hitler could be permanently successful, could be permanently successful only in Africa, for Africa affords a far greater opportunity for an appeal along nationalistic lines than areas in the African dispersion. Garvey's admiration for Hitler and Mussolini was not, however, an unqualified one. His admiration was based on the objective consideration of their political style and philosophy. He was too astute not to realize, however, that their theories could spell only ruin for Africa, and he opposed them resolutely on this basis. As early as 1924, he dispatched a telegram to Mussolini from the Fourth International Convention of Negro People of the World, requesting a change in Mussolini's Africa policy and self-determination of Italian colonies in Africa. His dual attitude of limited endorsement and hostile opposition to Hitler and Mussolini can best be explained by a 1933 statement on Hitler. Adolf Hitler, the German Chancellor, cannot be mistaken for anything else than a patriot. We are interested in Hitler only from the point of view of Germany's relationship with one race. It is evident that Hitler hates the Jew. He also hates the Negro. Whilst we admire him as a German nationalist, or rather patriot, we must not do so to the loss of our nationalism and patriotism. Therefore, it would be very unwise for us to encourage one as pronounced in his view as Hitler. Hitler stands for a greater Germany, which is his right, and the Negro should stand for a greater Africa, which is also his right. His opposition to Mussolini was cocked in similar terms, and a Negro World editorial of 1928 argued that Mussolini was not only aware of Garvey, but considered him a menace to his plans for the Italian imperialism in Africa. The editorial quoted from a speech in which Mussolini had referred to a Harlem riot. There is one great quarter in New York called Harlem, where the population is exclusively Negro. A great riot broke out there last July, which after a whole night of sanguinary conflict was fully controlled by the police, who found themselves opposed to compact masses of Negro. The editorial commented that Mussolini's account was exaggerated and represented an indirect warning to the United States that Afro-American race consciousness was a menace to his schemes in Africa, especially since he knew that Garvey's program came out of Harlem. The editorial continued, he may not call Marcus Garvey by name, but Negro throughout the world knows that he regards Garvey as the most potential hindering force to the scheming and planning to lay robbed hands on Africa's wealth. It ended in prophetic vein. We are somewhat puzzled in common with other beholders at a new attitude for Rastafari toward the ancient enemy of Ethiopia. But we will not take hasty judgment. When Mussolini invaded Ethiopia in 1935, Garvey's opposition became strident and particularly and partic- and practically every issue of his Black Man was adorned with hostile article and poems. The following from the Smell of Mussolini is typical. Let all Italian live and die in shame for what their mad dog did to our dear home. Their Mussolini's bloody savage name. Smell stink from Addis back to sinful Rome. We all march to crush the Italian dog, and at the point of gleaming, shining sword, we all lay quiet, low, violent Roman hog. Garvey's concept of nationhood was therefore extremely well developed. He was a provisional nation, biding the time of African liberation. Within maybe 50 years, Garvey conjectured, while W.E.B. Du Bois and the NAACP will be sending up petition to Congress asking to introduce another dire anti-lynching bill. Marcus Garvey and the UNIA will be coming up the Hudson Bay with a flotilla of battleships, dreadnought and cruisers to land our first ambassador. And whilst they'll be introducing bills to Congress, we will be entertained in the White House as being the first ambassador for the great African Republic. And let me tell you, they will hear from them. They will hear from us then. There can be no doubt that Garvey's assumption of nationality filled a great void in the lives of Black people, especially during his most successful years. Almost nowhere on the globe did Black people at this time had a government of their own. And the UNIA, reaching as it did into every area where Black people live, sowed the seed of nationalism and on occasion even acted as a provisional government. The end of chapter 1.
Yes, chapter 3. Excellent
I'm
job.
sorry, chapter 3.
Yeah, we did it. Woo!
Chapter 3. So we will get a better understanding of it, the pieces. So there's a lot of stuff in one chapter to digest, but we will get a better understanding as we dissect the chapter when we go through the questions that pertains to this chapter. So that being said, the hope is to have the questions completed for the previous chapter up to chapter 3. And so as we dive into that, we'll kind of play it by ear to see if we have time to get into chapter 4 next week. So any questions, comments, or concerns of this week's reading?
Great job, Sister Alexandria and Sister Diane, for the reading. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
I say first.
Thank you. Any questions? If there aren't any questions, concerns, comments, to our reading this week, I move that we, close out the meeting. And if, if Brother Ross is still on the phone, can you please close us out?
President Ross, are you available?
He's probably muted. I'll move that you close us out, Brother John, if you don't mind.
No problem, my pleasure. Everyone would, please put your black fists in the air, repeat after me. One God,
One
One
God,
God,
one aim,
One
aim,
aim,
one destiny.
one
one destiny.
destiny.
Africa,
Africa,
for the Africans,
For
For
the
the
Africans,
those at home,
those
those
at
at
home
home,
and those abroad.
and
and
those
those
abroad.
abroad.
Race first, family.
Peace first, family.
Race first.
Grace first, everyone. Peace and blessing
Go in peace, family.
until we see
Love is
again.
grace.
thank you.
Okay, thank you.